There is a building in your city that you have walked past 100 times. You know the one. The old one. The one with the towers that seem too tall for their era, and the stonework that seems too precise for the tools that were supposedly available, and the dome that catches the morning light in a way that makes you stop, just for a second, and feel something you cannot name. A stillness, a warmth in your chest, a sense that the air inside that building is different from the air everywhere else. You probably told yourself it was the architecture, the beauty of old things, the weight of history pressing down through stone and mortar and stained glass. But what if it was not the beauty at all? What if that feeling in your chest was not an emotion? What if it was a frequency? For the last several decades, a quiet and persistent line of inquiry has been threading through the margins of architectural history, alternative archaeology, and suppressed science. It does not appear in mainstream textbooks. It is rarely discussed in universities. The people who pursue it are often dismissed, ridiculed, or simply ignored. But the questions they are asking are not going away, because the buildings are still there, and the buildings do not lie. The theory, stated plainly, is this: the great cathedrals, basilicas, domed civic structures, and ornate municipal buildings of the world were not built as places of worship or governance. They were not built as monuments to faith or empire or civic pride. They were built as machines, sophisticated, carefully engineered machines designed to collect, amplify, and transmit forms of energy that our current scientific establishment does not fully acknowledge and cannot fully explain. They were healing centers. They were power stations. They were frequency generators operating on principles that predate everything we call modern physics. And they were built by a civilization so advanced, so widespread, and so thoroughly erased from the historical record that we do not even have a settled name for it. Some people call it Tartaria. And tonight, we are going to walk through its cathedrals together. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, slow, immersive history is what you come here for, please take a moment right now to subscribe and leave a comment below, telling me which building you have always felt something strange inside. I want to know, because you are going to have a lot of thoughts by the end of this one. Get comfortable, find your position, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin. The world before the reset. There is a problem with the 19th century, and the problem is this: it is too full. If you look at the historical record of the 1800s, particularly the middle decades, you find a period of construction so staggeringly productive, so architecturally ambitious, so geometrically perfect, that it strains the limits of what we know about industrial capacity at the time. Cities across Europe, Russia, North America, and South America were apparently being built from scratch, simultaneously using techniques that would challenge modern contractors working with modern machinery. Grand railway stations, domed civic halls, ornate post offices, cathedrals with ribbed vaulting so precise that the mathematical relationships between every arch, every column, and every window opening can only be described using concepts from acoustical physics that were not formally codified until the 20th century. The standard explanation is that these buildings were the product of a grand flowering of human civilization. The Industrial Revolution had unlocked new productive capacity. New wealth was flowing. Ambitious civic leaders commissioned ambitious architects. Skilled craftsmen executed their visions over decades of painstaking labor. The buildings we see today are the monuments to human ambition and human skill at their finest. That explanation is satisfying on the surface, but it does not survive contact with the specific details. In 1848, the city of San Francisco had a population of approximately 1,000 people. By 1850, following the gold rush, that number had exploded to around 25,000. By 1870, the city had a population of approximately 150,000. And yet, by that same decade, San Francisco already had buildings. Grand buildings, ornate, multi-story, dome-bearing structures with ironwork facades and arcaded ground floors and proportions that match the great civic buildings of Paris and Vienna and St. Petersburg. Buildings that looked, in the photographs of the time, not like the products of a 20-year construction boom driven by gold rush wealth, but like the remnants of something that had already been there, something older. The researcher community that has gathered around these questions is diverse and, frankly, not always coherent. Some of what circulates under the banner of Tartaria theory is speculation layered on speculation, reaching far beyond what the evidence supports. But underneath the noise, there is a core of genuinely anomalous architectural evidence that has never been satisfactorily explained. And at the center of that evidence, again and again, you find the same thing. The buildings are designed around acoustic and electromagnetic principles that their supposed builders could not have known. That is not a small thing. Number one, the civilization they do not want to map. The word Tartaria appears on European maps as early as the 13th century. It refers, in the broad strokes of medieval cartography, to a vast territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia and into what is now China. On some maps, it covers an area larger than any other named region on Earth. Marco Polo passed through its edges. European diplomats sent emissaries to its courts. The name appears in serious historical documents, in correspondence between kings and popes, in the journals of merchants and soldiers and missionaries. And then gradually, the name disappears. Not because the territory ceased to exist, not because the people who lived there were absorbed into a different civilization through the slow processes of cultural exchange. The name disappears abruptly in the historical record around the early 19th century. The territories it described were absorbed into the Russian Empire and the expanding colonial maps of European powers, and the name Tartaria was retired, reclassified, distributed among smaller regional names that carried none of the geopolitical weight of the original. Why? The conventional answer is that Tartaria was never a single unified civilization to begin with. It was a loose European cartographic label applied to the steppe peoples of Central Asia, and as European knowledge of that region became more precise, the broad label was replaced by more specific ones. The Mongols, the Manchus, the various Turkic peoples, the Cossacks. The cartographic simplification of Tartaria was simply the natural process of increasing geographical knowledge. That explanation is plausible. It may even be partially correct, but it does not explain the buildings, because across the territories that were once labeled Tartaria, and across the territories that were supposedly settled and built up by European civilization in the early 19th century, you find the same architectural vocabulary, repeated with a consistency that is difficult to explain through parallel independent development, the same proportional systems, the same ornamental grammar, the same relationship between dome diameter and interior acoustic properties, the same placement of towers at specific intervals that create, when you map them across a city, a geometric grid that has no functional explanation in terms of civic planning, but has a very clear explanation in terms of frequency transmission. The hypothesis, as it has developed among the most technically rigorous researchers in this community, is not that Tartaria was a simple empire in the conventional sense. It was something more like a civilization, organized around a shared technological and philosophical system. A system in which the design of buildings was not an aesthetic choice, but a functional one, in which the placement of a tower, the curve of a dome, the thickness of a wall, the ratio of nave length to nave width were all engineering decisions made in service of a specific physical function. The function of those buildings was to interact with the earth, more specifically with the electromagnetic and acoustic fields that the earth constantly generates and constantly transmits. And the people who built them understood those fields with a precision that our own civilization is only now, stumblingly, beginning to rediscover. Number 2. The architecture that should not exist. In 1889, the Universal Exposition was held in Paris, and the centerpiece of that exposition was the Eiffel Tower, a wrought iron lattice structure, 300 meters tall, built in approximately 2 years by a workforce of around 300 construction workers using the industrial technology of the late 19th century. The Eiffel Tower is rightly celebrated as an engineering achievement. It is also, in the context of what we are discussing tonight, extremely instructive, because the Eiffel Tower took 2 years, a large dedicated workforce, and the full industrial capacity of one of the most advanced nations on Earth to construct. Now look at the buildings that were supposedly constructed in the same era, in places that had none of those advantages. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow was supposedly begun in 1839 and completed in 1883, 44 years of construction. And it is a building of such staggering complexity, such precise stonework, such mathematically refined acoustic geometry, that modern architects studying it have described the construction timeline as implausible, even with modern equipment. The main dome rises 79 meters above the floor. The interior acoustic properties are such that a whisper spoken at one specific point on the floor can be clearly heard at another specific point 40 meters away, a phenomenon that depends on an elliptical geometry so precise that even a deviation of a few centimeters in the curve of the dome would destroy the effect entirely. This is not an accident. This is engineering. The Cathedral of St. Isaac in St. Petersburg is another example. Officially begun in 1818 and completed in 1858, 40 years of construction for a building with a dome diameter of 21.5 meters, exterior columns of granite in each weighing about 114 tons, and an interior so precisely calibrated in its acoustic properties that specific frequencies resonate through the entire structure at amplitudes that have been measured by modern acoustic engineers and found to correspond exactly to frequencies associated with human physiological effects. Specifically, the relaxation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Your body calms down inside that building, not because it is beautiful, though it is, not because it is old, though it is, but because the building is generating a specific acoustic environment that your nervous system responds to at a cellular level, and that acoustic environment was built into the structure by design, by people who understood exactly what they were doing. How did 19th century Russian builders know about parasympathetic nervous system responses to specific acoustic frequencies? They did not, because they did not build it. They inherited it. And that inheritance is the thing that the official history of architecture cannot accommodate. And so it is the thing that the official history of architecture pretends not to see. Number 3, domes and the physics of resonance. Let us talk about domes, not the meaning of domes, not the symbolism of domes, not what domes represent in the theological vocabularies of different religious traditions. Let us talk about what domes do, physically, acoustically, electromagnetically, and why a civilization with a sophisticated understandings of those physical properties would build domes on almost everything. A dome is, at its simplest, a curved surface that redirects sound. When you speak inside a domed space, the sound waves do not simply radiate outward in all directions and dissipate into the walls. They are redirected by the curve of the dome, focused, bounced, recombined. The exact behavior of sound inside a dome depends on the specific geometry of the dome, its height, its diameter, the relationship between those two dimensions, the presence or absence of a lantern opening at the apex, the surface texture of the interior. A dome built with the right geometry does something remarkable. It takes the ambient acoustic energy of the space, including the soft sounds of breathing, of footsteps, of the human heartbeat, and it reflects and amplifies them in a standing wave pattern. A standing wave is a wave that does not travel through a medium, but instead oscillates in place, creating regions of high amplitude and regions of low amplitude in a stable, persistent spatial pattern. If you have ever seen the patterns that form in sand on a vibrating plate, those are standing waves made visible. The patterns are beautiful and geometric and entirely determined by the frequency of the vibration and the geometry of the container. A dome is a very large, very sophisticated container for standing waves. The great domed buildings of what we are calling the Tartarian civilization were not randomly sized. Their dimensions follow specific ratios. A dome with a diameter of roughly 21 meters, like St. Isaac's, will sustain standing wave patterns at frequencies in the range of approximately 7 to 8 Hz under the right conditions. 7 to 8 Hz is the range of the Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic frequency generated by the interaction between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, which has been identified by researchers as a fundamental frequency to which human biological systems are attuned. It is also the frequency range of human brain activity during deep meditative states, and the low end of the frequency range associated with theta brainwaves, which are the brainwaves of deep relaxation, creativity, and what meditators describe as expanded states of consciousness. 7 to 8 Hz, built into stone, by people who were supposedly unable to calculate structural loads with any precision. The researchers who have been measuring the acoustic properties of these great domed structures have found, again and again, that the interior resonance frequencies are not accidental. They are not the byproduct of builders trying to make a beautiful space and accidentally producing these acoustic effects. The frequencies are too precise, too consistent across too many different buildings in too many different geographic locations to be coincidental. They are the target. The acoustic environment is the product, and the stone and the mortar and the soaring vaulted ceilings are the machinery used to produce it. You have sat inside one of these buildings. Almost certainly you have, and you have felt something that you could not explain. A quieting, a slowing, a sense that your thoughts were becoming less urgent, that the ordinary anxious chatter of the mind was softening, that you were, for a few minutes, simply present in a way you rarely are. That was not God, or rather, it was not only the idea of God, it was physics. Number 4, the Tartarian free energy hypothesis. Here is where the conversation gets wider, and I want to walk through this carefully because it touches on concepts from physics that are genuinely contested, genuinely complex, and genuinely interesting, and I do not want to oversimplify them in either direction. The Earth is an electromagnetic system. That is not a fringe claim. That is established physics. The Earth has a magnetic field generated by the motion of its liquid iron core. The Earth's surface and the ionosphere together form a cavity that resonates at the Schumann frequencies I mentioned earlier. The Earth generates and sustains electromagnetic fields of various frequencies continuously, driven by the internal dynamics of its core, by the interaction of the solar wind with the magnetosphere, by lightning strikes which occur approximately 100 times per second somewhere on the planet's surface, and by geological processes involving the movement of charged particles through rock formations. These fields are real, they are measurable, they are not subtle or speculative. What is more speculative, but not unreasonably so, is the question of whether a sufficiently sophisticated technology could tap into these fields in the way that a radio antenna taps into radio waves. The energy is there. The question is whether it can be collected and used. Nikola Tesla believed it could. His Wardenclyffe Tower project, begun in 1901 and destroyed in 1917, was designed to do precisely this: to collect the electromagnetic energy of the Earth and the ionosphere and transmit it wirelessly across the planet. Tesla was not a fringe thinker. He was one of the most technically rigorous engineers in the history of electrical science. His alternating current system powers your home right now. His radio transmission patents were foundational to every wireless communication system on Earth. When Nikola Tesla said that the Earth's electromagnetic energy could be collected and transmitted without wires, he was not fantasizing. He was describing an engineering project. The Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. Tesla ran out of funding when J.P. Morgan withdrew his financial support. The structure was demolished in 1917. The project died, or it appeared to die, because the buildings were already there. The researchers working on the Tartarian hypothesis have identified a specific architectural pattern in the great civic buildings, cathedrals, and municipal structures of the 19th century and earlier. The pattern involves the placement of copper-clad or metal-tipped spires and towers at specific positions on the building's roof. The number of spires, their height, their spacing, their orientation relative to the building's long axis, their relationship to the dome or central structure, all follow consistent ratios across buildings from different continents and different supposed cultural traditions. These ratios, when analyzed in terms of electromagnetic theory, describe an antenna array, not a metaphorical antenna, not a symbolic representation of reaching toward heaven, though that symbolism was certainly layered over the functional design in the religious buildings. A literal electromagnetic antenna array designed to collect atmospheric and terrestrial electromagnetic energy. The spires collect. The dome amplifies and focuses. The interior of the building is the output space, where the concentrated electromagnetic energy is delivered to the human beings inside. This is the healing cathedral. This is the machine. Number 5, copper spires and the architecture of collection. Look at the Cathedral of Cologne. Look at it carefully, not as a religious building, not as a Gothic masterpiece, not as a symbol of medieval Christian ambition, but as an engineering system. There are, on the exterior of Cologne Cathedral, 2 main towers rising to approximately 157 meters, the tallest cathedral towers in the world for a significant period of history, plus hundreds of smaller pinnacles, spires, and finials distributed across the roofline in a pattern that, when mapped from above, traces a geometric lattice of extraordinary precision. The main towers are sheathed in stone, but the pinnacles, the smaller pointed projections that stud the roofline, like the teeth of some vast comb, are finished at their tips with metallic elements. In the original construction, many of these metallic elements were copper or copper alloy. Copper is an excellent conductor of electromagnetic energy. It does not rust. It does not lose its conductive properties over time. It is, in fact, the material of choice for electromagnetic antenna construction, today, as it was in Tesla's experiments, and as it is in every radio transmitter and receiver on the planet. Gothic cathedral architecture, as it is taught in art history courses, is explained through the language of theology. The spires reach toward heaven. The pointed arches direct the eye upward. The abundant glazed windows fill the interior with light, which was understood as a physical manifestation of divine grace. The height and the complexity of the structure are expressions of the ambition and devotion of the communities that built them. None of this is wrong, exactly. The theological vocabulary was real. The faith of the builders was real. But the theological vocabulary was applied to structures whose proportions had already been determined by engineering requirements that preceded the theology. The pointed arch is not only a spiritual form, it is the most efficient form for transmitting compressive loads to the ground, allowing taller walls and larger windows than the rounded Roman arch. Gothic cathedral architecture did not develop the pointed arch for aesthetic reasons, and then discover it had structural advantages. The pointed arch was an engineering solution that was subsequently given theological meaning. The same process applies to every element of the Tartarian architectural system. The spires were collection points. The nave, the long central hall of the cathedral, oriented traditionally on an east-west axis, was a waveguide, a channel that directed the collected energy toward the altar end of the building. The apsis, the rounded east end that, in acoustic terms, functions as a parabolic reflector, concentrating the energy and returning it into the nave. The people who sat in the nave for services were sitting inside a functioning electromagnetic and acoustic system. They were, in the language of the Tartarian researchers, receiving treatment. The long services, the hours of sitting in the resonant space with the chanted liturgy, adding its own acoustic energy to the standing wave environment, were not simply religious observances. They were healing sessions, and the specific frequencies of Gregorian chant, which are not arbitrary, which follow precise mathematical relationships that have been independently found to correspond to physiologically beneficial acoustic frequencies, were the carefully selected inputs to the system. The monks who maintained the chanting tradition were not just preserving a liturgical practice. They were operating a machine. They just no longer knew that is what they were doing. Number 6. The World Fairs and the Erasure. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, and what was built for that fair is one of the strangest things in American architectural history. In approximately 18 months, on a site of roughly 690 acres of former swampland on the south side of Chicago, a complete city was constructed. Not a collection of temporary exhibition halls, though that is how it is described in the official record. A city, with grand boulevards and reflecting pools and classically proportioned public buildings of extraordinary architectural ambition. The Central Court of Honor, the so-called White City, contained buildings with facades of classical columns, arched entrances, domed roofs, ornamental sculpture, and proportional systems directly derived from the grandest civic architecture of Rome and Paris. These were not simple exhibition sheds dressed up to look impressive. They were architecturally sophisticated structures, built at a speed and scale that challenges belief. And then, after the exposition closed, almost all of them were demolished. Within a few years of the fair's closing, the vast majority of the White City buildings were gone. Some were demolished intentionally. Others were destroyed by fire. The site, which had been, for a brief period, one of the most architecturally remarkable places in the United States, was cleared. The researchers asking questions about Tartaria and the mud flood and the architectural reset look at the Chicago World's Fair and see something different from what the official history presents. They do not see a temporary exhibition that was built and then demolished. They see evidence of a different process entirely. They see the remnants of existing structures, cleaned up, presented to the public as a temporary exhibition, and then cleared away as part of a systematic process of erasing the evidence of the previous civilization. The White City, on this reading, was not built in 18 months. Nothing that architecturally complex is built in 18 months. It was uncovered in 18 months, or selectively restored in 18 months. And then the cover story of its construction was provided to the public, along with the photographs of the construction process, which show buildings going up, but notably do not show the foundations and substructures that would reveal what was there before. This is the mudflood hypothesis, and it is the part of the Tartarian narrative that tends to get the most attention and generate the most controversy. The mudflood hypothesis proposes that at some point in the 18th or 19th century, a global or near-global event, possibly a rapid increase in sediment deposition, possibly a deliberate act of cultural erasure, possibly a combination of both, resulted in the lower levels of many of the world's great cities being buried under several meters of material. The buildings were not demolished. They were buried. And what we see now as the ground floors of 19th century buildings are actually the second or third stories of the original structures. The real ground level and the real ground floors of these buildings are meters below the current street level, filled with sediment and, according to some researchers, still partially intact. This hypothesis is extraordinary. It requires a scale of event and concealment that is, frankly, difficult to accommodate within any conventional understanding of how history works. But the evidence, and I want to be specific about this, the evidence for unusual sediment layers beneath many major cities is real. The evidence for buildings with architectural features that make no sense at current ground level, windows at ankle height, ornate decorative elements facing underground, staircases that lead down into what is currently basement level, but which were clearly designed as entry-level features, is real and photographic and extensive. Something happened to these cities. The question is what? Number 7. The orphan trains and the repopulation. Between 1854 and 1929, an organization called the Children's Aid Society, along with several other similar organizations, transported approximately 250,000 children from the cities of the eastern United States to rural communities across the Midwest and the West. These children were transported on what became known as the orphan trains. They were, officially, orphaned or abandoned urban children being relocated to farming families who would provide them with homes, food, and work. The orphan train program is a documented historical fact. It is not contested. The numbers are not contested. 250,000 children, over 75 years, relocated from eastern cities to the rural interior. The Tartarian researchers look at the orphan train program and see something that the conventional history does not address. The timing and the geography of the program correspond almost exactly to the period of rapid urban development in the Midwest, and to the specific regions where the grand civic buildings of the supposed Tartarian civilization are most concentrated. If you accept the mud flood hypothesis, that a global event in the early to mid-19th century buried the lower levels of these cities and killed or displaced a significant portion of the population, then you have a problem. You have magnificent buildings, grand civic structures, cathedrals, railway stations, city halls, opera houses, covered markets. You have all the infrastructure of a sophisticated civilization, but you have no people to inhabit it. The population has been destroyed or displaced. What do? You bring in new people. You bring them in quickly, under administrative control, in numbers large enough to fill the cities. You bring in children, specifically, because children are young enough to be told whatever you want to tell them about the history of the places they are being brought to. Children do not remember the previous civilization. Children will accept, without question, the explanation that these magnificent buildings were constructed by recent human effort, that the civilization that produced them was their own civilization, beginning within living memory. 250,000 children settled in the interior, in the exact decades when the grand civic buildings of those regions were supposedly being constructed. Whether this interpretation is correct is impossible to say with certainty, but the correspondence is striking, and it is the kind of correspondence that demands an explanation, even if the explanation turns out to be something much simpler and less dramatic than the one the Tartarian researchers are proposing. The official history has never fully explained where the population of these rapidly developing interior cities came from. The immigration records exist, and they are substantial. European immigrants came in very large numbers in this period, but the timeline of urban development in many interior American cities, the ratio of architectural complexity to documented population growth, does not balance. There were more buildings than builders, and that is a fact that the conventional historical record has never satisfactorily addressed. Number 8. The vaults beneath the cathedrals. Under almost every major cathedral in Europe, there are vaults. This is not controversial. Cathedral crypts are well documented. They are famous, in many cases. The crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral in London contains the graves of some of Britain's most notable figures. The crypt of the Paris Pantheon is one of the city's most visited sites. The catacombs beneath many Italian churches have been explored and mapped for centuries. But the vaults I am talking about tonight are not the standard crypts that everyone knows about. They are the ones that are not on the maps. In the last several decades, as ground-penetrating radar technology has become more accessible, archaeologists, urban planners, and independent researchers have used it to scan the subsurface conditions beneath the foundations of major European cathedrals and civic buildings. The results have been, in many cases, surprising. The structures extend significantly further below the current ground level than the official architectural records indicate. In some cases, the below-ground structure is substantially larger and more complex than the above-ground structure. Chambers, corridors, arched galleries, wells, and channels have been detected at depths of 5, 10, sometimes 15 meters below the current floor level. Some of these features have been excavated and documented. Others remain officially unexplored. In a few cases, access to subsurface spaces beneath major cathedrals has been restricted by the religious institutions that control them, with restrictions justified on the grounds of structural safety, which is plausible, or on the grounds of the sanctity of burial spaces, which is also plausible, but which leaves the independent researcher with no way of knowing what is actually down there. The Tartarian researchers have a theory about what is in those vaults. The theory is that the subterranean levels of these buildings are where the actual operational machinery of the healing cathedrals was located. The visible, above-ground portions of the buildings, the nave, the choir, the transepts, the domes and towers, were the output spaces, the spaces where the human recipients of the building's energy would gather. But the engine room, the place where the Earth's electromagnetic energy was collected, processed, and directed upward into the inhabited spaces, was below ground. This would make physical sense. The Earth's electromagnetic fields are strongest at and below the surface. A structure designed to tap those fields would want its collection apparatus as close to the source as possible. The above-ground spires and towers were the atmospheric collectors, bringing in energy from above. The subterranean chambers were the earth collectors, bringing in energy from below. The dome was the processing and amplification space in the middle, a building sandwiched between two sources of electromagnetic energy, with a carefully tuned, resonant space in between. That is an engineering system. The question of what was in those subterranean chambers, specifically, what materials, what structures, what arrangements of stone and metal and water, remains largely unanswered, because the chambers themselves remain largely unexamined. But in the cases where subterranean spaces beneath these buildings have been partially excavated, researchers have noted the consistent presence of certain features. Deep wells connected to underground water, channels of flowing water directed along the building's long axis, stone benches or platforms at specific intervals along the walls, alcoves in the walls at regular spacings. Flowing water is an excellent conductor of electromagnetic energy. It is also a significant acoustic medium, capable of sustaining standing waves at very low frequencies for extended periods. The presence of directed underground water channels beneath the cathedrals is not explained by the official archaeological record. It is noted and then set aside, because the official record has no framework within which to interpret it. The Tartarian researchers have a framework. The water was part of the machine. Number 9. The science of acoustic healing. I want to spend some time on this because it is the part of the Tartarian healing cathedral theory that has the most direct support from contemporary mainstream science. And I think it is important to establish that what I am describing is not entirely outside the bounds of recognized knowledge. The study of the effects of sound on human physiology is called psychoacoustics, and it is a well-established scientific discipline. We know, with a high degree of certainty, that sound at specific frequencies has measurable effects on the human body. We know that low-frequency sound in the range of approximately 40 Hz stimulates gamma-wave synchronization in the brain, a state associated with high-level cognitive function and what meditators describe as clarity and insight. We know that infrasound, sound at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, roughly below 20 Hz, can produce feelings of unease or the sense of a presence in the room, effects that have been documented in scientific literature and that some researchers have used to explain reports of supernatural experiences in old buildings. We know that specific sound frequencies can influence heart rate variability, cortisol levels, and the activity of the autonomic nervous system. We know that the ancient practice of chanting and toning, found in virtually every major religious tradition on Earth, produces measurable physiological benefits, including reduction in blood pressure, improvement in respiratory function, and changes in brainwave patterns consistent with states of deep relaxation. We know that the specific frequencies used in different chanting traditions, Gregorian, Vedic, Tibetan, Sufi, while superficially different, share a common mathematical structure that relates them to the acoustic resonance properties of the human body itself, specifically the resonant frequencies of the chest cavity and the cranial vault. The human body has resonant frequencies. Everything physical has resonant frequencies. The specific vibration rates at which it naturally oscillates. The chest cavity resonates at around 150 Hz. The skull resonates at around 12 to 15 Hz depending on individual anatomy. The cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, has been found to oscillate at a frequency of approximately 0.1 Hz, once every 10 seconds, in a slow wave linked to the rhythms of breathing and cardiac activity. An environment filled with specific frequencies interacts with the body's own resonant systems in specific ways. A strong acoustic environment at 150 Hz will excite the resonance of the chest cavity, producing the sensation of warmth, fullness, and physical well-being that many people describe when they are in resonant environments. An environment rich in 12 to 15 Hz frequencies will interact with the cranial resonance and alter the electrical activity of the brain. An environment at Schumann resonance frequency, around 7 to 8 Hz, will bring the brain's own electrical oscillations into alignment with the Earth's fundamental electromagnetic rhythm, a process that has been described by meditators for thousands of years and that neuroscientists have recently begun to measure and study. The great cathedrals, with their specific architectural dimensions, their stone surfaces, their domed spaces, their directed water channels, their metallic spires, are acoustic and electromagnetic environments of extraordinary precision. If you were designing a machine to deliver healing frequencies to the human body, you would design something that looked a great deal like a Tartarian cathedral. And the people inside those buildings, for the hours of the weekly service, were inside the machine, receiving its output. They did not know the physics. They knew the experience. They called it the presence of God. They called it grace. They called it peace that passes understanding. They were not wrong about the experience. They were simply missing the mechanism. Number 10. Sacred Geometry and the Engineering Manual. Every civilization that has ever been described as building in the Tartarian style, and the geographic range of this style, when you begin looking at it, is staggering. It spans Russia and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the British Isles and North and South America, has used a system of proportions that is called, in the general language of alternative history, sacred geometry. Sacred geometry is often discussed in mystical terms, as if the geometric relationships encoded in ancient and medieval buildings were metaphysical assertions about the structure of reality, and that interpretation is not entirely wrong. But behind the metaphysics, there is mathematics, and behind the mathematics, there is engineering. The most fundamental ratio in the sacred geometric tradition is the one associated with the Greek letter phi, approximately 1.618, the golden ratio. The golden ratio appears with extraordinary frequency in the proportioning of the great buildings we are discussing, the ratio of nave length to nave width, the ratio of dome height to dome diameter, the ratio of the main facade width to the height of the central tower. These ratios in the precisely built structures of the Tartarian period conform to phi with an accuracy that can only be achieved through deliberate engineering, not through intuitive design or aesthetic preference. Why phi? The golden ratio has a mathematical property that makes it uniquely suitable for the design of resonant structures. It is the most irrational number in the technical mathematical sense, meaning that it is the number least well approximated by fractions with small denominators. This property makes structures proportioned to phi remarkably stable in their acoustic behavior across a wide range of frequencies. A nave whose length-to-width ratio is exactly phi will sustain standing waves at a broad spectrum of frequencies simultaneously, creating a rich, complex acoustic environment rather than the single-frequency resonance that a simpler, rectangular space would produce. The designers of the Tartarian cathedrals were not decorating their buildings with phi. They were engineering their acoustic environments with it. Similarly, the placement of columns, the spacing of windows, the positioning of chapels and side aisles all follow mathematical rules that, in acoustic terms, determine the distribution of the standing wave field within the space. The columns are not decorative supports that happen to be regularly spaced. They are acoustic diffusers, scattering the sound field to prevent the buildup of strong standing wave nodes in specific locations and distribute the acoustic energy more evenly through the space. The windows, with their specific heights and widths, are tuned absorbers, each removing a specific frequency band from the acoustic field to sculpt the overall frequency response of the space. This is not speculation. This is basic architectural acoustics. The science that explains these effects is not fringe science. It is the science that concert hall designers use today. What is remarkable is not that these effects exist, but that they were apparently understood and deliberately engineered by builders working centuries before the formal development of architectural acoustics as a discipline. The sacred geometric tradition, transmitted through the master builder guilds, through the Masonic fraternity, through the apprenticeship systems of the great medieval workshops, was the engineering manual for the healing cathedrals. The geometric ratios were not arbitrary mystical choices. They were specific engineering parameters, encoded in a symbolic language that could be transmitted across generations and across cultures without requiring the transmitters to understand the physics behind them. The geometry was the recipe, the building was the dish, and the healing was the meal. Number 11. What the old maps reveal. If you have spent any time in the Tartaria research community, you have encountered the maps. And if you have not, let me describe them. From the 13th century onward, European cartographers produced maps that include, in the territories of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, labels and illustrations that describe an organized, sophisticated civilization. Framauro's map of 1450 shows Tartarian cities with identifiable urban plans. Mercator's map of 1569 labels a substantial portion of the Eurasian interior as Tartaria Magna, Greater Tartaria, and places it among the named civilizations of the known world on an equal footing with the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire. The Blaeu Atlas of 1635 contains a detailed map of Tartaria that shows a network of named cities, rivers, roads, and territorial divisions. And then the maps change. In the 19th century, as European political control over Central Asian territories increased, the cartographic vocabulary shifts. The named cities of the earlier Tartarian maps begin to disappear, replaced by terrain features and tribal names. The organized urban network visible in the earlier maps is dissolved into a series of scattered, disconnected settlements. Did those cities disappear? Were they destroyed? Or were they simply no longer mapped? Their existence inconvenient for the new political narrative that presented the region as a vast, underdeveloped wilderness being brought into the light of civilization by European powers. The researchers cross-referencing the early Tartarian maps with modern satellite imagery and archaeological survey data have found some interesting correspondences. The sites of named Tartarian cities in the old maps often correspond to locations where modern archaeology has identified significant archaeological potential, sometimes potential that has not been fully investigated, in some cases potential that has been noted and then not followed up with excavation. There is a site in Kazakhstan, in the region that the old maps call the heart of Greater Tartaria. That satellite imagery shows us having a regular geometric pattern of subsurface features covering an area of several square kilometers. The pattern is not natural. It shows the characteristic regularity of planned urban construction. It has been noted in the academic literature. It has not been excavated. There is another site in Siberia where a series of regular mounds, too geometrically consistent to be natural formations, stretches across a landscape that the historical record describes as never having been settled. The mounds have been surveyed, they have not been excavated, and there are the cities of the Ural region, the cities where the grand civic buildings of the supposed 19th century construction boom are most densely concentrated, where the architectural vocabulary is most clearly Tartarian, and where the ground-penetrating radar surveys, the ones that have been done, consistently show subterranean structures at depths that indicate burial predating the official construction dates by several decades or more. The maps describe a civilization. The ground contains a civilization. And the official history says there was no civilization. One of these things is wrong. Number 12. The mud flood event. The mud flood hypothesis is the most dramatic element of the Tartarian narrative, and it is the one that requires the most careful treatment, because it makes claims about physical events of a scale that would be difficult to conceal and difficult to explain. The hypothesis, in its most developed form, proposes that at some point in the late 18th or early 19th century, a rapid and widespread deposition of sediment buried the lower levels of cities across a substantial portion of the northern hemisphere. The event was not a single flood in the conventional sense. It was more like a rapid increase in sediment flow across a wide area, possibly triggered by an atmospheric event, possibly by the rapid melting of permafrost, driven by a period of unusual warming, possibly by a combination of geological and atmospheric factors that drove enormous quantities of sediment-laden water across the landscape. The evidence for unusual sediment layers beneath major cities is one of the more compelling threads in this discussion, because it is not speculative. It is physical. In the process of urban infrastructure work, subway construction, utility installation, foundation work for new buildings, workers in many major cities have encountered strata of sediment at depths of 3 to 5 meters below the current street level that do not correspond to the gradual accumulation that normal urban settlement would produce. The sediment is uniform, covering large areas, and its deposition dates, where they have been scientifically established, cluster in a range that corresponds to the early to mid-19th century. The conventional explanation for these sediment layers is that they represent the debris of urban demolition and reconstruction, the normal byproduct of cities being continuously torn down and rebuilt over time. This explanation is plausible for some of the deposits, but for others, the composition of the sediment, uniform fine-grained material with no debris content, no artifacts, no construction waste, not even pollen from the local vegetation, is inconsistent with construction debris. It looks, to the geologists who have examined it, more like flood deposit, like material that was carried in by water and settled out as the water slowed and retreated. The Tartarian researchers look at these sediment layers and see the physical trace of the event they hypothesize. The civilization that built the healing cathedrals was covered, not destroyed, not demolished, but buried. The buildings survived, or enough of them survived, because they were built to extraordinary standards, with foundations reaching far below the surface and walls of such thickness and strength that a sediment event could not simply collapse them. The lower floors were buried. The upper floors, the floors above the sediment level, remained accessible. And the new civilization, the civilization that followed the event, the civilization that the official history presents as the builders of these structures, simply moved in above the sediment line and told a story about having built everything from scratch. This is a very large claim. The evidence for it is suggestive but not conclusive. But the sediment layers are real, and they are waiting for the explanation that the conventional history has not yet provided. Number 13. The piezoelectric earth. There is a property of certain crystalline materials called piezoelectricity. When a piezoelectric material is subjected to mechanical stress, squeezed or stretched or bent, it generates an electrical charge. The effect works in reverse as well. Apply an electrical charge to a piezoelectric material and it will deform mechanically. This property is the basis of many familiar technologies. The igniter in your gas stove, the crystal oscillator that keeps time in your watch, the ultrasonic transducers in medical imaging equipment. The most abundant piezoelectric mineral on Earth is quartz. Granite, the stone from which a substantial proportion of the world's great civic buildings, cathedrals, and monuments are constructed, including the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral and the foundations of countless Tartarian structures, contains quartz in quantities that make it significantly piezoelectric. A large granite building sitting on a granite bedrock foundation is a piezoelectric system. When the bedrock is stressed by tectonic activity, by the tidal flexing of the Earth's crust under the gravitational pull of the moon, by the passage of seismic waves, the granite generates electrical charges. Those charges propagate upward through the foundation and into the structure of the building. In a sufficiently massive structure, built of the right materials and proportioned in the right way, those charges could accumulate to significant levels. Tectonic stress is not rare. The Earth's crust is under continuous tidal stress from the gravitational interaction between the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. The tidal flexing of the solid Earth, which is measurable and measured, subjects the crust to regular cyclic stress at frequencies corresponding to the daily and monthly tidal cycles. This means that any sufficiently massive granite structure, properly founded on granite bedrock, is receiving a continuous input of piezoelectrically generated electrical charge, cycling at tidal frequencies. The great cathedrals of the world are not randomly located. Many of them are sited on granite outcroppings. Many of them are positioned at sites that were considered sacred by the pre-Christian peoples who inhabited those regions. And the sacredness of those sites was often associated with unusual physical experiences reported by people who spent time there. Visions, healing, contact with non-ordinary states of consciousness. The Tartarian researchers suggest that these sites were identified by the builders of the original civilization through direct experience of their energetic effects, that the sites were chosen because they were already generating strong piezoelectric outputs, and that the buildings erected on them were designed to collect, amplify, and deliver those outputs to the people inside them. The stone was not inert, the stone was alive with charge, and the buildings were built to use it. Number 14. The ball lightning hypothesis and why it falls short. One of the more common mainstream attempts to explain the unusual energetic phenomena reported in and around the great cathedrals, and the broader category of anomalous light phenomena reported at sacred sites globally, is ball lightning. Ball lightning is a real phenomenon. It is documented. It is reported by credible witnesses, including scientists, pilots, and military personnel. It consists of a self-sustaining plasma formation, a ball of ionized gas that maintains its structure for seconds to minutes while moving through the air, sometimes in apparent defiance of the normal dynamics of air movement. Its exact mechanism is not fully understood, which is itself remarkable given how much effort has been put into studying it. Ball lightning has been invoked as an explanation for a wide range of anomalous energetic phenomena, including the lights reported at sacred sites, the unusual electromagnetic effects measured inside old stone buildings, and some of the more dramatic accounts of healing experiences in cathedral spaces. The problem with the ball lightning explanation, when it comes to the systematic energy phenomena we are discussing tonight, is the same problem that arises whenever a stochastic, unpredictable phenomenon is invoked to explain systematic, repeatable effects. Ball lightning is random. It occurs without warning, at irregular intervals, in a wide variety of locations, with no consistent relationship to the structural or geological properties of the sites where it is observed. The effects we are discussing in the healing cathedrals are not random. They are consistent, repeatable, site-specific, and structurally determined. The same building produces the same acoustic resonance frequencies every time. The same sites produce the same experiential effects on visitors, century after century. The same geometric ratios appear in the same architectural contexts across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years. Random phenomena do not produce systematic effects. Ball lightning can explain a specific unusual event at a specific location on a specific occasion. It cannot explain the consistent, structural, engineered character of the energy environments we are discussing. The mechanisms at work in the healing cathedrals are not random. They are the product of deliberate design. The design is physically encoded in the stones and the proportions and the materials of the buildings. And understanding that design requires not the invocation of exotic and unpredictable natural phenomena, but the application of the well-understood physics of acoustics, electromagnetism, and piezoelectricity to the specific geometric and material systems that the buildings embody. Number 15. Bioluminescence and the living stone. There is another alternative explanation that sometimes appears in discussions of the healing cathedrals, and it is worth addressing briefly before we move on. Not because it is a strong alternative, but because it touches on a genuinely interesting aspect of the relationship between living systems and stone structures. Bioluminescence, the production of light by living organisms through chemical reactions, is widespread in nature. Many species of marine organisms are bioluminescent. Certain fungi produce a faint light. The firefly is the most familiar example. It has been proposed by some researchers that certain of the unusual light phenomena observed in old stone buildings, particularly the faint, diffuse glow that some sensitive observers report seeing in the interior spaces of ancient stone structures under certain conditions, might be attributable to bioluminescent organisms colonizing the stone. There are indeed bioluminescent fungi that colonize stone. There are bioluminescent bacteria. The conditions inside old stone buildings, high humidity, specific mineral compositions, stable temperatures, regular darkness, are favorable for certain bioluminescent organisms. It is not implausible that some of the subtle light phenomena observed in these spaces could be biological in origin, But the bioluminescence hypothesis, like the ball lightning hypothesis, fails to account for the systematic engineered character of the effects. A colony of bioluminescent fungi might explain a faint organic glow in a specific corner of an old building. It does not explain the acoustic resonance properties of the domed spaces. It does not explain the physiological effects on heart rate and brainwave patterns documented in visitors to these spaces. It does not explain the geometric precision of the architectural systems or the consistent cross-cultural distribution of the same design principles. The bioluminescence explanation is interesting as a supplement. As an explanation of the whole, it is wildly insufficient. The healing cathedrals were not glowing because of fungi. They were glowing to the extent that they were glowing because they were running. Number 16. The Cathedral of Milan and its 3,400 spires. The Duomo di Milano, the Cathedral of Milan, has 3,402 marble spires. That number is not approximate. It has been counted. 3,402 individual pointed projections rising from the roofline, facade, buttresses, and pinnacles of a building that took nearly 6 centuries to complete, from the late 14th century to the early 20th. Each spire is finished with a marble statue at its apex. There are 2,245 marble statues on the exterior of the building. The interior contains 40 columns, so massive that their base diameter is approximately 3 meters each, and the vaulted ceiling rises 45 meters above the floor. The Duomo is, by any measure, one of the most complex stone structures ever built. When you look at it through the lens of the Tartarian healing cathedral theory, certain things become immediately apparent. The 3,400 spires are not decorative excess. Decoration would not require such precision of replication across such a diverse three-dimensional surface. Each spire is individually crafted to the specific geometric constraints of its position on the building, taking into account the local curvature of the surface, the angle of the supporting structure, the relationship to adjacent spires. The mathematical work involved in designing 3,400 individually positioned spires that collectively form the electromagnetic collection array implicit in their distribution is staggering. It is not the work of people decorating a church. It is the work of engineers designing a system. The Milan Duomo sits on a foundation of remarkable geological complexity. The site is underlain by a mix of glacial deposits and bedrock, with several underground watercourses passing beneath it. When the modern underground railway was being built beneath the city in the 20th century, engineers discovered that the Duomo's foundations extend significantly further below the current ground level than the historical records indicated, and that the lowest levels of the foundation structure are built over a series of chambers that have never been fully explored. The resonant acoustic properties of the Milan Duomo's interior have been studied by acousticians. The findings are consistent with what the Tartarian theory predicts. The interior sustains standing wave patterns at multiple frequencies simultaneously, creating a remarkably complex acoustic environment. The dominant resonance frequency of the main nave is in the range that corresponds to the human physiological relaxation response. And the distribution of the standing wave nodes, the points of maximum and minimum amplitude in the resonance pattern, corresponds closely to the traditional liturgical spatial arrangement, with the altar positioned at a node of maximum amplitude and the congregation area positioned in the zone of sustained resonance. The people who stood in that space, week after week, for centuries, were standing inside a functioning resonance system. They called it the House of God. They were not wrong. Number 17. Russian cathedrals that face the wrong direction. In the standard academic account of Christian sacred architecture, cathedrals are oriented on an east-west axis, with the altar at the east end and the main entrance at the west end. The east orientation is theologically motivated. The east is the direction of the rising sun, associated with the resurrection, and the altar faces east so that the priest, during the liturgy, faces the direction of the rising sun. This is the standard, and most cathedrals conform to it, more or less, with deviations explained by the constraints of the specific site. But a significant number of Russian cathedrals, specifically the older ones, those dating from the pre-Petrine era before the westernization policies of Peter the Great began transforming Russian culture in the early 18th century, are oriented not on a precise east-west axis, but on an axis slightly north of east, pointing in a direction that corresponds not to true east, but to magnetic east. The direction toward magnetic north rotated 90 degrees. Magnetic east is not the same as geographic east. The difference between the two depends on the local magnetic declination, which varies by location and has changed over time as the Earth's magnetic north pole has shifted. The specific angle of deviation in these Russian cathedrals, when analyzed by researchers who have mapped their orientations precisely, corresponds not to the current magnetic declination at those sites, but to the magnetic declination as it would have been at those sites at a date considerably earlier than the building's official construction dates. This is a significant finding. It suggests that the orientation of these buildings was not set by their official builders in the periods they were supposedly constructed, but that the orientation was determined earlier by people working with a different magnetic north, and that the official builders simply built on the existing foundations without fully understanding why the orientation was what it was. The orientation toward magnetic rather than geographic east has an electromagnetic significance. A structure oriented along the magnetic field lines of a site is maximally coupled to those field lines. It will interact more strongly with the local magnetic field than a structure oriented in any other direction. It will be more effectively coupled to the electromagnetic energy flowing along the field lines, more effectively able to collect and channel that energy. The Russian cathedrals were not pointing at sunrise, they were pointing at the field, and the people who set their orientation knew exactly what they were doing. The westernization of Russian culture under Peter the Great involved, among many other things, the introduction of Western architectural practices and the discarding of many of the older building traditions that had characterized the pre-Petrine Russian cities. The great churches built in the post-Petrine period follow the standard east-west orientation. The buildings that predate the cultural reset, or that were built on foundations predating it, retain the magnetic orientation that marks them as products of the older system. The cultural reset was not only political and social, it was architectural, and the architecture tells the story that the history books edited out. Number 18. The last Tartarian healers. There is a figure that appears in the folk traditions of many of the regions where the Tartarian architectural legacy is most concentrated. A figure described by different names in different traditions, but with a consistent set of characteristics. In Russian folk tradition, such figures are sometimes called folkvi. In some Slavic traditions, they are called znahar. In some Central Asian traditions, they are referred to by titles that translate roughly as those who know the stone. In all of these traditions, the figure is a healer, specifically a healer who works inside specific buildings, using specific chanting or toning practices to treat illness. The treatments described in these folk accounts are remarkably consistent across cultures and geographies that would not be expected to share traditions. The healer brings the patient to a specific place in the building, a place that is described in each tradition with specific spatial references, near the center, under the dome, at the intersection of the long and short axes. The healer then produces sustained vocal sounds at specific pitches, chosen based on the patient's condition and the healer's assessment of the patient's energetic state. The patient lies on a specific surface, sometimes stone, sometimes a wooden platform, sometimes directly on the ground. The treatment lasts for a specific duration, described differently in different traditions, but generally ranging from an hour to several hours. The outcomes described in these folk accounts are sometimes dramatic. Recoveries from conditions described as severe. Reductions in what sounds, in the language of the accounts, like chronic pain. Improvements in what sounds like depression or severe anxiety. Accounts of patients arriving barely able to walk and leaving under their own power. These accounts should be approached with appropriate skepticism. Folk healing traditions are often unreliable in their specifics, and the tradition of the healer who works miracles is common enough to be a cultural archetype rather than a specific historical report. But the specific, consistent detail of the spatial and acoustic methodology that the healer works inside a specific type of building, at a specific location within that building, using sustained vocal tones, is not explained by the general archetype of the miracle healer. It is too particular, too technical. It looks less like a story about supernatural power and more like a description of a therapeutic protocol. A protocol that uses the building as an instrument. The vocal tones of the healer are the input signal. The building is the amplifier and processor. The concentrated shaped acoustic and electromagnetic environment at the target location in the building is the output. The patient, lying in that environment, is receiving a specific therapeutic frequency treatment. The folk traditions of the healer in the old building are the cultural memory of a medical technology. And the memory survived, as cultural memory does, long after the understanding of the mechanism was lost. Number 19. What modern science accidentally confirms over the last 2 decades, a series of mainstream scientific investigations has produced findings that, taken together, paint a picture of the acoustic and electromagnetic properties of ancient stone structures, that is, to put it gently, consistent with the Tartarian healing cathedral theory, even if none of the individual researchers involved would frame their findings in those terms. In 2008, a team of archaeologists and acousticians studying the Neolithic passage tombs of Ireland, specifically Newgrange and the tombs of the Loughcrew complex, published findings showing that the interior chambers of these structures sustained standing wave resonance at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that had been independently identified by researchers in psychoacoustics as associated with significant alterations in normal cognitive processing when sustained exposure occurs. The researchers noted that the resonance frequency was consistent across multiple structurally independent chambers and suggested that it might reflect a deliberate design choice, an encoding of acoustic function in the structural geometry. The same frequency, 110 Hz, has since been identified as a resonant frequency of the Chavin de Huantar complex in Peru, the Hal Saflieni hypogam in Malta, and several of the great Kiva structures of the American Southwest. These structures are from different cultures, different time periods, different geographic regions, different construction materials. They share no obvious historical connection, but they share a resonant frequency. That is not coincidence. In 2016, a study published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America measured the acoustic properties of Chartres Cathedral in France and found that the building's interior produced a frequency response that, in the author's words, was consistent with the acoustic requirements for optimal speech intelligibility at low vocal volumes. The cathedral was not simply a loud space. It was a precisely calibrated space in which a quiet voice could be heard with remarkable clarity throughout an enormous volume. The authors attributed this to the specific geometry of the nave and choir and the acoustic absorption characteristics of the stone. What the study did not address, though the data supports it, is that the same geometric relationships that produce the clarity of speech transmission also produce the sustained resonance at frequencies below the speech range that are associated with the physiological effects I have been describing. Clarity of speech in the high frequencies, healing resonance in the low frequencies. The building doing two things at once. The acoustic clarity allowed the liturgy to be heard. The low-frequency resonance produced the physiological state in which the liturgy was received. The two functions were not independent. They were integrated aspects of a single, sophisticated acoustic design. A design that modern science is only now learning to describe, and that the builders of the healing cathedrals apparently understood in full. Number 20. The question that architecture will not answer. There is a question that sits at the heart of everything we have discussed tonight, and it is a question that the official discipline of architectural history, for all its depth and sophistication, has never satisfactorily answered. The question is this: why did the builders of the great medieval cathedrals care so much about getting the proportions exactly right? This is not a rhetorical question. The historical evidence for the extraordinary precision of medieval and early modern architectural measurement is overwhelming. The documents of the great cathedral workshops, the building manuals, the lodge records, the letters between master builders are full of detailed geometric specifications, ratios that had to be maintained to fractions of a hand's width across structures hundreds of meters long, proportional relationships that had to be preserved through generations of construction spanning centuries. The builders cared, with an intensity that seems almost compulsive by modern standards, about getting the numbers exactly correct. The standard explanation is that the geometric precision was theologically motivated. The building was an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, and it had to be perfect because God deserved perfection. The numbers were sacred, the proportions were divinely ordained. Getting them wrong was not an engineering failure, but a spiritual one. This explanation is coherent within its own framework, but it raises a question it cannot answer. Why are the theologically mandated proportions the same proportions that, as we now know, produce optimal acoustic resonance for the frequencies associated with healing and altered states of consciousness? Why does the divinely ordained geometry of the cathedral happen to be precisely the engineering geometry of a healing frequency machine? Either we are seeing an extraordinary coincidence in which the theological intuitions of medieval builders about divine proportion happened to align perfectly with the engineering requirements of acoustic healing technology, or we are seeing the preservation, imperfectly understood, of engineering knowledge that predates the theology that came to explain it. The Tartarian hypothesis is that the engineering came first. The civilization that built the first cathedrals knew what they were building. They knew the physics, or they had an equivalent knowledge system that produced the same engineering outcomes from different conceptual starting points. They built the proportions into the buildings because the proportions were functional requirements, not symbolic preferences. When that civilization was lost, through whatever combination of catastrophe, erasure, and deliberate suppression was involved, the buildings remained. The builders who came after did not understand what they had inherited. They knew the buildings were sacred. They knew the geometry was sacred. They preserved the proportions because tradition demanded it, because the guild systems encoded the numbers in their ritual practices and transmitted them without explanation. The theology came to fill the explanatory gap. The buildings needed to mean something, and the theologians provided the meaning. The meaning they provided, the image of divine order, the reflection of heavenly perfection in earthly stone, was beautiful and true and inspiring. But it was not the original meaning. The original meaning was functional. The building heals. That is what it was built to do. And somewhere in the stone, in the precisely cut granite and the mathematically proportioned vaults and the copper-tipped spires pointing toward the electromagnetic field of the living earth, that original function is still present, still running, waiting for the people inside to remember what they came for. The civilization, waiting in the stone. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. We have walked through the acoustic physics of domed spaces and the mathematics of sacred geometry, and the electromagnetic properties of granite and copper and flowing underground water. We have traced the outlines of a civilization so thoroughly erased that it does not have a fully accepted name, and we have looked at the buildings it left behind, buildings that our official history credits to a different civilization, buildings that our physics tells us were doing something that the credited civilization did not understand. We have considered the mud flood, the orphan trains, the world fairs, the sealed vaults, the magnetic orientations, the folk healers, and the 2 centuries of archaeological anomalies that conventional scholarship has noted and then set aside because it has no framework within which to interpret them. I want to be honest with you about what we know and what we do not know. We know the buildings are real. We know their acoustic properties are real and physically measurable. We know the physiological effects of sustained exposure to the specific frequencies those buildings generate are real, documented by mainstream science, and significant. We know that the architectural principles encoded in those buildings are consistent across a range of geographic and cultural contexts, so broad that this independent parallel development is a less plausible explanation than a common source. We know that the official timelines of construction for many of the grandest of these buildings are, at minimum, difficult to accept without qualification, given what we know about the industrial capacities of the periods involved. We know that the sediment layers beneath many major cities are real and that their official explanation is incomplete. What we do not know with certainty is the nature and extent of the civilization that produced these buildings. We do not know the precise character of the event or events that separated us from that civilization. We do not know the full scope of the deliberate historical erasure, how much was erased, by whom, for what reasons, and how thoroughly. We are, in the language that I find most honest, reading a very old and very damaged text by a very faint light, and we are making out shapes that seem to tell a story. But we cannot be certain we are reading every character correctly. What I can tell you with certainty is this. The next time you walk into one of these buildings, the next time you step through the great doors of a cathedral or a grand civic hall and feel that stillness, that dropping of the shoulders, that quieting of the mind that happens whether you want it to or not, pay attention. Your body is responding to something real, something physical, something that was put there, deliberately and with extraordinary technical skill, by people who understood the human body and the energetic fields of the earth and the relationship between them with a depth that we are only beginning to approach. The building is talking to you. It has been talking, for centuries, to everyone who walked through its doors. It will go on talking long after everyone alive today is gone. The only question is whether you are listening. The Tesla connection and the Wardenclyffe precedent. Nikola Tesla deserves more than the brief mention I gave him earlier in this discussion, because his work is not peripheral to the Tartarian hypothesis. It is, in many ways, the bridge between the ancient engineering we have been describing and the science that gives us the vocabulary to discuss it. Tesla was born in 1856 in what is now Serbia, in a region that falls squarely within the territory that the old maps described as part of the Tartarian sphere. He grew up surrounded by the old architecture, the churches and civic buildings of the late Ottoman and early Austro-Hungarian period, buildings that in many cases sat on far older foundations. We do not know what, if anything, Tesla absorbed from his physical environment in those formative years, but we know what he built, and we know what he said about what he was trying to do. In 1899, Tesla established an experimental laboratory in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and conducted a series of experiments in wireless electrical transmission using the Earth itself as a conductor. He reported that he was able to transmit electrical energy through the ground over significant distances, and he described the Earth as a resonating body with specific natural frequencies that could be excited and utilized. His notebooks from this period contain observations about the electromagnetic properties of the Earth that predate the formal scientific description of the Schumann resonance by more than half a century. He was describing the Schumann resonance in 1899. The Schumann resonance was not formally predicted until 1952 and not experimentally confirmed until 1954. Tesla was working with it experimentally 50 years earlier. How? The official answer is that Tesla was simply ahead of his time, a genius who intuited physical realities that the formal science of his era had not yet described. That is probably part of the answer, but the Tartarian researchers offer a supplementary possibility, that Tesla had access to knowledge systems. Through his background, through his reading, through connections we cannot fully document, that encoded an understanding of the Earth's electromagnetic properties, developed by the civilization whose engineering we have been examining tonight. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, the structure he built on Long Island between 1901 and 1906, before funding was withdrawn, was not a new idea. It was, the researchers suggest, a reconstruction of a principle that had been implemented in the great tower-bearing structures of the Tartarian period. The metal-tipped wooden tower at Wardenclyffe, designed to reach into the upper atmosphere and draw down its electrical charge, was doing, in concentrated experimental form, what the copper-tipped spires of the great cathedrals had been doing in distributed, architectural form for centuries. Tesla knew what those buildings were, or he had rediscovered it. J.P. Morgan, who funded the Wardenclyffe project until he withdrew that funding in 1903, is reported to have asked Tesla a question that became famous. He asked, "Where do I put the meter? How do I charge people for electricity that comes from everywhere?" Tesla, who envisioned free, universally accessible electrical power, apparently did not have a satisfactory answer from Morgan's perspective. The funding was withdrawn. The project died. The tower was sold for scrap metal in 1917. But the question Morgan was asking, the question of metering and control and monetization, is exactly the question that the healing cathedral system made unanswerable. If the building heals you simply by being present, if the energy it uses comes from the earth itself and costs nothing to collect, if anyone who walks through the door receives the benefit regardless of their ability to pay, then there is no meter, there is no revenue stream, there is no business, there is only health, freely available to whoever enters. The destruction of the Wardenclyffe Tower was not simply the cancellation of one eccentric inventor's project. It was the foreclosure, for at least another century, of the possibility that the Tartarian model of free healing energy could be reconstructed in the modern world. The city grids and the frequency maps. When you look at the maps of major cities from the bird's-eye perspective, something becomes visible that is not apparent at street level. The grand civic buildings, the cathedrals, the post offices, the railway stations, the opera houses, the university buildings, the city halls, are not randomly distributed across the urban fabric. They form patterns, not the patterns of civic planning in the conventional sense, the Main Street logic of putting important buildings on important thoroughfares. The patterns go deeper than that. They are geometric patterns, grids within grids, relationships of distance and angle that, when mapped precisely, describe structures that have no explanation in terms of conventional urban planning. Researchers who have mapped the positions of the grand civic buildings of several major European and North American cities using GIS software and high-precision coordinates have found that the distances between buildings, measured carefully, conform to specific numerical ratios. The ratios are not the simple ratios of urban block dimensions. They are ratios derived from the mathematics of wave propagation, specifically the ratios that determine constructive interference between waves transmitted from multiple point sources. Constructive interference occurs when waves from two or more sources arrive at a given location in phase, meaning their peaks and troughs align, so that they add together rather than cancelling. The result is an amplified wave at that location. If you have two towers transmitting the same frequency, and you want to create a zone of maximum signal strength at a specific location between them, you space the towers at a distance that is a specific multiple of the transmission wavelength. The grand civic buildings of these cities are spaced at distances that correspond to the constructive interference patterns for electromagnetic waves in the Schumann resonance frequency range. The city itself was a frequency array, not each building in isolation. The buildings working together, transmitting from their metallic spires, were creating overlapping fields whose constructive interference zones were precisely the public spaces, the plazas, the parks, the markets, where populations gathered. The people going about their daily lives in these cities were living inside a frequency environment. They were not just healed when they went to church on Sunday. They were maintained in a state of energetic well-being by the constant operation of the city's distributed antenna array. Throughout every day, every city was a healing machine, every public space was a treatment zone, and the population was healthier, more resilient, more psychologically stable as a result, not through any magical process, but through the continuous low-level delivery of electromagnetic and acoustic frequencies that the human biological system needs to function optimally. The modern city does not do this. The modern city, with its steel and glass and radio frequency interference from wireless networks and the electromagnetic noise of its electrical infrastructure, is in many ways the acoustic and electromagnetic opposite of the Tartarian city. It is not a healing environment. It is, in the precise technical sense we have been using tonight, a noisy one. The signals the human body needs are present but buried under a density of interference that the healing systems of the old cities were never designed to compete with. One of the things that many people who visit historic city centres in Europe report, without being able to articulate exactly why, is that they feel better in those places than in the modern parts of the same cities. The old quarters, with their old buildings, their stone streets, their irregular organic layouts that still follow the underlying geometry of the original Tartarian grid, feel different from the modern extensions. They feel calmer, more human, more sustaining. That is not nostalgia. That is the residual operation of a system designed to make you feel exactly that way. The hidden wells and the water lines. Under the floor of nearly every major medieval cathedral in Europe, if you dig, you find water. Not always a running stream, sometimes a still pool, sometimes a damp layer of clay, sometimes a carefully constructed well, lined with stone, sealed, its location marked in the original building plan, but lost to the current administrators of the building. But water, in some form, at some depth, under almost every one of these structures. The placement of cathedrals and churches on sites with underground water is usually explained as practical. Medieval builders sought sources of water for construction and for the community that would gather at the church. Wells were dug, and then the church was built over them. This explanation is partly true, but it does not account for the specificity of the water placement in the buildings, where it has been precisely documented. In those buildings, the underground water does not simply sit beneath the building, it runs beneath it, in a direction, along a channel that is aligned with the building's long axis. The water flows from one end to the other, entering under the tower end and exiting under the altar end, or vice versa. The flow is directed, it is aligned. Flowing water in an aligned channel beneath a large stone structure does several things. It creates a constant, low-level infrasonic field as the turbulent water generates pressure waves in the surrounding stone. The frequency of these pressure waves depends on the flow, velocity, and the dimensions of the channel, and in the documented cases, The frequencies produced are in the range of 1 to 8 Hz, the range that overlaps with the Earth's Schumann resonance and with the human brain's alpha and theta wave frequencies. It creates an electromagnetic field because water contains dissolved ions and its flow constitutes a weak electrical current, and a current flowing through a conducting medium generates a magnetic field around it. The magnetic field, generated by an underground water flow beneath a large stone structure, permeates the stone and projects into the space above it. It is weak by modern engineering standards, but the human body is sensitive to very weak magnetic fields, as research on magnetoreception in humans has documented, and a weak but consistent magnetic field aligned with the long axis of a space. The size of a cathedral nave is not trivial. It maintains the moisture content of the stone above it at a specific level, and the electrical and acoustic properties of stone are sensitive to moisture content. Dry granite has different conductivity and different acoustic characteristics than slightly moist granite. The underground water keeps the stone at the optimal point for its role in the building's electromagnetic and acoustic system. The water is not incidental to the machine. The water is one of the machine's primary working fluids, and the medieval tradition of the holy well, the sacred spring, the healing water associated with sites of pilgrimage and miraculous cure, the tradition that predates Christianity in every culture where it appears, is the folk memory of the most fundamental element of the Tartarian healing technology. The water heals, not because it is holy, because it is part of the machine. The suppressed researchers and their findings, the ideas we have been discussing tonight, do not exist in a vacuum. They have a research history, incomplete and fragmented and partly obscured, but real. And some of the most interesting figures in that history deserve mention, because their work adds texture and specificity to the general framework of the Tartarian healing cathedral theory. John Ernst Worrell Keely was an American inventor who, in the 1870s and 1880s, claimed to have developed a technology he called an sympathetic vibratory physics, a system of mechanical and acoustic devices that could, he claimed, tap into a fundamental vibratory force underlying all matter and energy. His demonstrations attracted significant attention and funding, and his devices produced effects that observers described as astonishing. He was also, in the view of the mainstream scientific establishment of his time, a fraud. When he died in 1898, investigators dismantled his devices and found concealed mechanical and pneumatic systems that could, they argued, have produced his effects without the exotic physics he claimed. The story of Keely is used, in most histories of alternative science, as a cautionary tale about the credulity of people who want to believe in revolutionary energy technologies. But the Tartarian researchers look at Keely's theoretical writings as opposed to his commercial demonstrations and find something more interesting. His descriptions of sympathetic vibration, of the resonant relationship between vibratory systems and the forces that sustain them, of the specific frequency ratios that produce what he called interetheric resonance, are consistent with, and in some cases anticipate by decades, the acoustic physics of standing waves and the electromagnetic physics of resonant coupling. Keely may have been a fraud in his commercial dealings, but his theoretical framework was not invented from nothing. It drew on something. Victor Schauberger was an Austrian forester and inventor who, in the early and mid-20th century, developed a radical theory of water's role in energetic systems. He argued that water, particularly naturally flowing water following its preferred spiral vortex path, was not simply a passive liquid, but an active energetic medium, capable of storing and transmitting forms of energy that conventional physics did not recognize. His practical experiments, which he described as deriving from careful observation of natural water systems, produced results that he and his supporters described as anomalous by conventional standards. He was brought to the United States in 1958, apparently by interests connected to the American military-industrial complex, and died shortly after returning to Austria, reportedly stripped of his documents and devices. The Tartarian interpretation of Schauberger is that his understanding of water's energetic properties was a partial recovery of the knowledge encoded in the underground water systems of the healing cathedrals. He approached it from the perspective of naturalistic observation rather than architectural engineering, but he was circling the same territory. And Royal Raymond Rife, an American inventor and researcher, who, in the 1930s, developed a system of treatment using specific electromagnetic frequencies to target specific pathogens. Frequencies he determined by measuring the resonant properties of individual organisms produced results that his contemporaries, including some mainstream physicians, described as remarkable. His technology was suppressed, his laboratory was raided, his research records were destroyed, and he died in poverty in 1971. Whether Rife's specific claims about destroying pathogens with resonant frequencies are valid, the question remains genuinely open in the literature on bioelectromagnetics, is less important for our purposes tonight than the principle his work embodied. The principle that living systems have specific resonant frequencies and that those frequencies can be influenced, both positively and negatively, by external electromagnetic and acoustic fields. That principle is not fringe science. That principle is the foundation of the healing cathedral. The children and what they remember. There is something that parents who take young children to old cathedrals and stone churches often report, something so consistent across different families and different buildings that it has become a kind of quiet, unacknowledged trope among parents who travel with small children. The children calm down, not because the adults tell them to be quiet, though that happens too, but spontaneously. Children who were restless and fractious in the street, who needed constant entertainment and stimulation, who were resisting the tourism and the walking and the adult conversation, will walk into an old stone church and simply quiet. They will stand and look up at the dome or the vault. They will want to sit down. Their voices drop without being asked. Their breathing slows. And often they will say something, in the direct and unfiltered way of small children, that the adults around them will file under charming things children say and then forget. They will say, "This place feels nice," or "Why does it feel soft here?" Or, as one parent reported to me in a comment that has stayed with me, their 4-year-old daughter said, pointing at the dome above them, "The singing comes from up there, but nobody is singing." Nobody was singing, but the building was resonating, at a frequency the 4-year-old could feel. Children are not biased by the need to explain things within an accepted framework. They do not have a theory of how buildings work that tells them a stone space should not feel soft or should not be generating a sound when no one is making one. They simply report what they experience. And what they experience consistently in these spaces is the experience that the healing cathedral was designed to produce. The technology still works. It was built to last. And the children, who have not yet learned to disbelieve what they feel, are still receiving it. What the mystics were actually describing. The mystical literature of every tradition that had access to the great stone buildings of the world contains descriptions of experiences that, in the vocabulary of those traditions, are described as supernatural. Visions, voices, healings, a sense of presence, of contact with a reality beyond the ordinary one. The transformation of consciousness that practitioners describe as enlightenment or grace, or the divine touch. The scientific reflex, when encountering these accounts, is to locate them in the psychology of the experiencer. The power of suggestion, the emotional weight of the religious context, the neurological effects of fasting and ritual, and the expectation of transcendence. These factors are real. They are part of what happens in these spaces. but they are not the whole story, because the mystical experiences associated with these buildings are not random. They are not evenly distributed across all places and all circumstances in proportion to the intensity of religious belief or ritual preparation. They cluster. They cluster spatially, at specific locations within specific buildings. They cluster temporally, at specific times of day or specific seasons when the acoustic and electromagnetic conditions within the building are most favorable. And they cluster demographically in ways that do not correspond to the expected distribution of suggestibility or religious credulity. The people most consistently reported as having strong experiences in these spaces are not necessarily the most devout. They are often people who came with no particular expectation, who entered the space for ordinary practical reasons and found themselves overwhelmed by something they had not anticipated and could not explain. The tourist who sat down to rest her feet. The worker doing repairs who stopped to eat his lunch in the nave. The skeptic who came to see the architecture and stayed for an hour without knowing why. These experiences are not being generated by the expectation of the experiencer. They are being generated by the building, the mystics who spent extended periods in these spaces, the monks who chanted for hours in the resonant air of stone chapels, the hermits who built their cells into the walls of old cathedrals, the pilgrims who slept overnight on the floors of healing shrines, were not simply applying the power of belief to neutral spaces. They were using the technology of those spaces the way the original designers intended, spending extended time in the resonant acoustic and electromagnetic environment, allowing the building to work on them at the frequency level, and reporting, in the language available to them, the results of that process. The mystical traditions are the user manual for the healing cathedral, written by people who had lost the technical vocabulary but retained the operational knowledge. Do this. Go to this place. Sit in this position. Make these sounds. Stay this long. The results will follow. They were not wrong. They had simply forgotten why it worked. The architecture of forgetting. The most remarkable thing about the civilization we have been discussing tonight is not that it built these extraordinary structures. Human civilizations build extraordinary structures. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Angkor, the standing stones of the British Isles, the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest. The capacity of human communities to produce architectural achievements that challenge later understanding is well established. The remarkable thing about the Tartarian civilization is that it was forgotten so thoroughly, so completely, so specifically, that the structures it built were absorbed into the narrative of a different civilization without generating the documentary trail that such absorption would normally leave. When one civilization conquers another and takes possession of its buildings, there are usually records of the transition, accounts of the conquest, documents describing the transfer of ownership or administration, archaeological layers that mark the change. The moment when the old religion was replaced by the new one, the moment when the old inscription was chiseled off and the new one put in its place, leaves a physical mark in the stone. In the Tartarian case, those marks are vanishingly rare. The buildings were not conquered. They were simply claimed, with a new story about their origins attached. The new story was told consistently, across a wide geographic range, by the institutions that took over the buildings, which suggests a degree of coordination in the retelling that goes beyond the normal organic processes of historical memory. Someone decided what the story would be. Someone distributed that story. Someone suppressed the alternative versions. This is not unprecedented in history. The rewriting of historical memory by institutions with the power to control the documentary record is well documented in cases where we have enough independent sources to reconstruct what happened. The Aztec destruction of earlier Mesoamerican historical records, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the systematic destruction of indigenous oral traditions by colonial educational systems. The deliberate forgetting of inconvenient histories is a human practice with many examples. What makes the Tartarian case distinctive is the scale and the thoroughness. A civilization that apparently spanned much of the Northern Hemisphere, that left behind thousands of architectural structures, that was documented on the maps of European cartographers for centuries, was reduced to a cartographic footnote and then erased from the footnotes as well, in a process that appears to have been completed within approximately a century. And the buildings that civilization left behind were kept, maintained, used, incorporated into the infrastructure of the new civilization, because they were too useful to destroy, because they still worked, because whatever the new civilization's understanding of what these buildings were and what they did, the people using them felt better inside them, and the people felt better inside them, produced healthier communities, and healthy communities are easier to govern than sick ones. The buildings were kept. The knowledge of what they were was discarded. And the world we live in today is the result of that decision. The frequency of remembering. There is a concept in physics called resonance, and we have discussed it extensively tonight in its acoustic and electromagnetic forms. But resonance has a broader meaning. Any system that has a natural frequency of oscillation will respond preferentially to external inputs at or near that frequency. It will amplify those inputs, sustain them, build them up over time while allowing other frequencies to die away. The human mind has natural frequencies too. Not just the neural oscillation frequencies that neuroscience measures with EEG, but cognitive and emotional frequencies. Modes of engagement with the world that, when the right input is provided, resonate through the whole system and produce that specific feeling of recognition, of rightness, of this is the thing I did not know I had been waiting to understand. The ideas in this documentary, for the people they resonate with, produce that feeling. Not because the ideas are necessarily and certainly correct in every particular, but because they address something real, because they point at the buildings that have always felt different and say, yes, they are different, and here is a framework for understanding why. Because they take the experience of the 4-year-old who said the singing comes from up there when no one was singing, and they say, she was right, and here is the physics of what she heard. The experience comes first. The experience is the data. The theories are our attempts to account for the data, and they will be refined and corrected as more data comes in and as the conceptual vocabulary for understanding this territory improves. What will not be refined or corrected is the experience itself. You have felt what these buildings do. You felt it before anyone told you what to feel. You felt it before you heard a single word of this documentary. You walked in and you felt it. Some of you are lying in the dark right now, in the quiet after the day, and this is not the first time you have wondered whether the official story of the world fully accounts for everything you have felt inside the old places. It does not. It was never designed to. The official story accounts for what can be measured, recorded, filed, and taxed. The buildings account for something else. They account for you, for the specific frequency of you, the resonant frequency of your body and your mind, and the relationship between you and the earth you live on. That relationship is what the healing cathedrals were built to serve, and it is what they are still serving, every day, for anyone who enters and pays attention. The star forts and the second system. There is another category of anomalous structure from the Tartarian period that we have not addressed tonight, and it deserves its own space in this discussion, because it adds a dimension to the healing cathedral framework that changes how the whole system looks. Across Europe and across the European colonial territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, there is a category of fortification structure known as the Star Fort. The Star Fort, as it appears in military architectural history, is described as a defensive innovation of the 16th and 17th centuries, developed to address the challenge that cannon fire posed to the tall, vertical walls of medieval castles. The solution was to eliminate the tall walls and replace them with low-angled ramparts in a star-shaped plan, so that every face of the fortification was protected by flanking fire from adjacent points of the star, and no approach offered a clear line of attack. This military logic is sound, and the star forts of the conventional historical record were indeed used as military fortifications. But the researchers who have been studying their geometry have noticed something that the military history does not account for: the angles of the star points, the proportions of the bastions, the geometric relationships between the inner and outer lines of the defensive plan are not optimized for military defense. They are optimized for something else. When you map the geometry of the star forts precisely, the angles and proportions conform to the same mathematical ratios, the same phi-derived relationships, the same acoustic engineering parameters that we find in the interior geometry of the cathedrals. The star fort is not a different category of Tartarian structure. It is the same category expressed in a different spatial arrangement. If the cathedral collected and focused electromagnetic and acoustic energy in a tall, vertical, interior-focused architecture, the star fort distributed and projected that energy in a horizontal, exterior-focused architecture. The cathedral was the point of concentrated delivery. The star fort was the field projector. The system of star forts distributed across a region, at the specific spacing that their construction history shows, was not a military defensive network. It was an energy distribution network. The population living within the effective range of a star fort was living within the fort's energetic output field, just as the population living within a city grid of healing cathedrals was living within the city's combined electromagnetic environment. The star fort was not protecting the population from external military threat. It was protecting them from internal energetic deficiency. It was maintaining the frequency environment that human beings need to function at their best. The military use was the cover story. The healing use was the mission. The animals know. One of the small but persistent details in the literature of sacred site research is the behavior of animals at these locations. Animals are not biased toward explanations. They do not have theories. They have direct, unmediated responses to the physical environments they inhabit. And the animals at the sites of the great old structures, the sites where the energetic properties we have been discussing are most strongly present, consistently behave in ways that are consistent with the therapeutic, electromagnetic, and acoustic environment hypothesis. Birds. At many major cathedral sites, specific species of birds have nested in or around the structures for as long as records exist. The behavior of these animals, the specific locations they choose within the structure, the specific times of day they are most active at the site, corresponds to the patterns of acoustic and electromagnetic output from the building in ways that would not be expected if the birds were simply choosing the location for its structural properties as a nesting site. Dogs. People who bring dogs into old stone churches in countries where this is permitted, particularly in rural areas of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Eastern Europe, often report that the dogs, who normally need to be managed and kept from wandering, will settle immediately on entering the church, often moving to a specific location in the interior, lying down and remaining there calmly for the duration of the visit. The specific locations dogs choose within these churches, when multiple observers' reports are mapped, cluster at the same points in the interior that the acoustic analysis identifies as nodes of maximum standing wave amplitude. The dogs are lying in the strongest part of the field, and they are calm. They are receiving what the building was built to deliver. Without any of the conceptual apparatus, the theology and the alternative history, and the electromagnetic theory that human beings require before they can accept what their bodies are already telling them. The animals just feel it, and they lie down. One last building. I want to end the body of this documentary with one specific building because it brings together more of the threads we have traced tonight than any other single structure I know. The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, completed in 537 CE under the Emperor Justinian. The Hagia Sophia is one of the oldest surviving large-scale domed buildings in the world. Its dome, which spans approximately 31 meters and rises approximately 55 meters above the floor, was, at the time of its construction, an engineering achievement of a magnitude that modern structural engineers still find remarkable. The dome is supported not on massive walls, but on a system of half-domes, arches, and piers that distribute the enormous compressive forces of the dome's weight through a complex structural skeleton that allows the walls to be opened with large windows, flooding the interior with light. How was this built in the 6th century? The conventional answer invokes the genius of its architects, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, and the resources of the Byzantine Empire. These were indeed remarkable engineers. But the structural system of the Hagia Sophia goes beyond what a straightforward application of the engineering knowledge of the 6th century should have been able to produce. Some of the structural details of the building, the way the pendentives carry the circular dome on a square base, the way the half-domes create lateral stability without sacrificing the open interior, the way the galleries distribute concentrated loads, reflect a level of three-dimensional structural analysis that was not formally developed as a mathematical discipline until the 19th century. The Tartarian interpretation is straightforward. Justinian did not build the Hagia Sophia. He rebuilt it or renovated it on foundations that were already there. The structural sophistication of the building reflects not 6th century Byzantine engineering, but the engineering of the civilization, whose foundations Justinian's builders were using. The acoustic properties of the Hagia Sophia have been measured by modern researchers, and they are extraordinary. The interior reverberation time, the time it takes for a sound to decay by 60 decibels after the source stops, is approximately 11 seconds at a frequency of 1000 Hz. For reference, a modern concert hall typically targets reverberation times between 1.8 and 2.2 seconds for orchestral music. The Hagia Sophia's 11-second reverberation is not an accident of its size. It is a deliberate acoustic design choice that produces an acoustic environment unlike any other surviving building. In an 11-second reverberation environment, sustained vocal tones do not behave as they do in ordinary spaces. They layer the harmonic content of a voice, the complex mixture of frequencies that the human vocal tract produces, is sustained and built up over the 11-second decay time, so that at any given moment, the acoustic field in the space contains not just the current note being sung, but the accumulated harmonic tail of the previous several notes. The result is a chord, a continuously changing, continuously evolving harmonic texture of extraordinary richness, produced by a single voice. The Orthodox liturgy, which was developed in the Hagia Sophia and which has been adapted over 14 centuries to the specific acoustic environment of that and similar buildings, uses sustained, slowly moving vocal lines that exploit this layering effect. The music sounds, in a building with the right acoustic properties, completely different from how it sounds in a dry acoustic space. It becomes a living, breathing, shifting harmonic cloud, surrounding the listener on all sides, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere. That is not an accident of liturgical development. That is the operating condition of the machine. The Hagia Sophia was a healing chamber before it was a church. It was a healing chamber before the Byzantines arrived. It was a healing chamber designed by people who understood what an 11-second reverberation in a space of those specific proportions fed with the specific frequency content of the sustained human voice, would do to the human nervous system. They designed a machine that heals through sound, and for 1500 years, people have been going inside it and being healed, and calling it something else. And that is the story of every cathedral, every basilica, every domed civic hall, every old stone building with proportions that seem too perfect, and acoustics that seem too good, and a physical presence that makes you, against all your practical intentions, sit down and breathe. They are all, in the end, the same building. They are all the same machine, and they are all still running. The keeper of the frequency. In the old lodge traditions of the master builders, the ones that transmitted the sacred geometric knowledge from generation to generation, without explaining the physics behind it, there was a role called, in various languages and various traditions, something that translates approximately as the keeper of the measure. The keeper of the measure was not the master builder. The master builder was the engineer, the designer, the person who organized the construction and made the day-to-day decisions. The keeper of the measure was the person who held the original standards. The actual physical measuring tools, the rods and strings and compasses calibrated to the fundamental ratios, were kept by this person. When a new building was to be begun, the keeper of the measure provided the foundational dimensions. When a question of proportion arose during construction, the keeper of the measure was consulted. The keeper of the measure did not need to explain why the proportions were what they were. That was not the role. The role was simply to ensure that they were correct, to maintain the chain of transmission from whatever original source the standards derived from, without breaking, without deviation, without the substitution of approximate values for the exact ones. The keepers of the measure were, in the language of the Tartarian hypothesis, the last link in a very long chain of transmission from the original civilization. They did not know the physics. They knew the numbers, and they transmitted the numbers with a fidelity that kept the buildings functional for centuries after the knowledge of their function was lost. When the keeper of the measure tradition finally broke, when the lodge systems that preserved it were either absorbed into more modern institutional forms or dispersed by the social disruptions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the chain was cut. New buildings were designed by architects using the aesthetic memory of the old proportions without the precise standards. The cathedral style was reproduced in the Gothic Revival and the Baroque and the neoclassical movements as an artistic vocabulary, as a way of making buildings look like the old buildings. But without the exact numbers, without the keeper of the measure's calibrated standards, the reproductions were not functional equivalents of what they copied. They were beautiful, but they did not heal. The great buildings that still function as the healing machines their original designers intended are the ones built before the chain was cut. The ones where the keeper of the measure's standards were applied generation after generation, with the precision that the machine requires. There are not many of them left untouched, but there are some, and they are waiting. The invitation in the stone. If you have listened to everything in this documentary and felt, at some point, the specific quality of feeling that I can only describe as recognition, not of information you knew before, but of something your body already understood, even if your mind had no language for it, then I want to say something directly to that part of you. You are not wrong about the buildings. You never were. Whatever framework you use to understand them, whatever vocabulary you bring to the question of what they are and what they do, the experience you have had inside them is real and physical and not reducible to belief or suggestion or the aesthetic pleasure of old, beautiful things. Something is happening in those spaces. It was put there deliberately, by people who cared, with an intensity we can barely imagine, about what happened to the human beings who entered those spaces. They built frequency environments calibrated to the human body because they understood the human body as a resonant system that needs specific frequencies to maintain its integrity, its health, its connection to the earth it lives on, and the cosmos it is part of. They built the machine because they knew what happened to human beings who were cut off from those frequencies. They got sick, they got frightened, they got small, they got disconnected from one another and from the living world. They built the machine to prevent that, to keep the connection alive, to keep the frequency going, and then something happened and the machine was forgotten and the connection was cut anyway. For most people, in most places, most of the time. But the buildings are still there, and the buildings still work. And every time you walk through those heavy doors and feel the air change and hear the quality of the silence shift and feel your shoulders drop and your breathing slow, you are receiving, across whatever gap of centuries separates you from the people who designed that moment, exactly the message they intended to send. We were here. We understood. We built this for you. Come in. Be still. Let the stone do what it was built to do. Let yourself be healed. If you are still here, and if this has settled into you in the way I hoped it would, I want to say something before you drift off. These questions matter. Not because the answers are certain, not because I am asking you to believe any particular version of what happened to the civilization we have been discussing tonight, but because the buildings are real, and the physics is real, and the experience of standing inside those spaces is real, and that reality is asking us to think more carefully about what we know and what we have been told and where those two things diverge. If you have a cathedral, a basilica, an old civic building, an ancient stone structure of any kind within reach of where you live, I want to suggest something. Go there. Go when it is quiet, early in the morning if that is possible, or on a weekday afternoon when the tourist traffic is low. Sit in the center of the space. Do nothing. Just breathe and let the building work on you. Notice what happens to your breathing. Notice what happens to your shoulders. Notice what happens to the quality of your thoughts. And then, when you come out, drop a comment here and tell me what you felt. Because the record of human experience inside these spaces, gathered over centuries, is one of the most consistent and compelling datasets in the entire history of human testimony. People have been walking into these buildings for hundreds of years and having the same experience. Quiet, calm, clarity, the sense that something in them has been reset. That dataset is telling us something. I believe it is time we started listening. If this kind of deep, slow, immersive alternative history is what brings you here, please subscribe so you never miss an episode. The community here is thoughtful and curious, and always worth reading in the comments. Share this with someone who walks past old buildings and wonders about them, and I will see you in the next one. Sleep well.